So on the 27th of January, I took this great trade that resulted me in one of the most perfect setups for a supply and demand trades ever. It was super smooth, it reacted perfectly, and already you can see how price immediately got here and dropped. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show you the lower time frames where I found my entry, how I set my stop loss, how I set my take profit, what I'm looking for when I enter, and how I draw the supply and demand zones. So first of all, the supply zone which I was trading off, we had this big push down. You see these big red candles. You can also see the wick here. Buyers try to push it up, they've failed. So already you can see buyers have lost control. What you want to look for is not only are sellers pushing it down, but have buyers also lost control. If you see a big wick, then that means buyers wanted to be present there, however they weren't present enough. If you see just a big red bar, cool, yeah, that means sellers are in control, but they haven't taken it from the buyers because the buyers weren't even trying in that area. As for my demand zone, I actually did draw this on a lower time frame, which is why it may look a little bit weird, but you can still see roughly where the demand zone does come in. You can see at the bottom, you see, these big green bars taking off, this explosive movement. So we do have a demand zone around here. If I was drawing it on the 1 hour time frame, I would have probably brought it a bit up here, but I did draw it on a lower time frame, which allowed me to get a slightly better demand zone that was a bit nicher. Obviously, the disadvantage with a smaller demand zone is if price didn't actually hit it and price actually stopped here and then reversed, then I wouldn't have hit my take profit. However, thankfully, this trade did work out very well, and potentially for even more earnings if your strategy allows you to capture trades to down here. So let me now hop down onto the 5-minute time frame, which is where I took my entry for this trade, and we'll just go find where we were. Here we go. So now you can see the supply and demand zone in much more detail. You can see how a lot of range started here and the selling pressure exploded out of this supply zone here. And we can see the same thing in this demand zone. So you can see we got a bit of a range and then followed by a big push up. So that's just even more confirmation that we are in a supply and demand zone. Look at how it is reacting on lower time frames. How are the candlesticks reacting on lower time frames as well? Are they ranging or are they doing quite big moves? Now you also want to find a balance with your supply and demand zones because you don't want them too big to where you can't actually take a decent trade, but you also don't want them too small to the point where it's just unlikely that price is going to stick inside those supply and demand zones and just wipe out your entry or not be able to capture an entry. I find having them around this size is a decent size. Maybe if I could get it a little bit smaller, then that would be even better, but I wouldn't go too much smaller than this. This really gives me a good indicator of areas where there are lots of buyers or lots of sellers with limit orders or stop orders. So here is my entry. Let me explain why I entered here. What we got here is we got price climbing, So we got big green bars. We do have the occasional red bar, but then we get these green bars and now we are in the supply zone. Why did I take this trade on this red candle here? Well, we're in the supply zone and all of a sudden we go from this big buying pressure to just selling pressure immediately to selling. This is obviously a key area where sellers are trying to step in and take over. Now you may have wanted to wait for more confirmation. Maybe you wanted to wait for this bar. Maybe you wanted to wait for a pullback like it slightly did here. But I was pretty confident in this supply zone. So I took the trade as soon as I saw this big red bar, which gave me a good indication that sellers were stepping in and sellers wanted to fight off buyers in this area. And as you can see, we went down a little bit. We then did slightly reverse back up, but still within the stop loss. And let me also explain why the stop loss is there. You can see the previous high of the supply zone. I set it just above the previous high. That gives me enough wiggle room, in my opinion. I find that when I set it here, well, yes, I can get just above the previous high of where we just were. Yes, I can get a tighter stop, but I find more often than not, the stop loss gets hit because you see, you're never going to perfectly time the top or the bottom of the market. So you want to give yourself enough wiggle room. And I find that putting it next to the previous high, rather than the previous high of where the supply zone started versus just the previous high of price, like here, gives me a slightly more wiggle room to allow a trade to be more successful. And in this case, that did work because as you can see, if I did do as I said, and if I did set it here, the stop loss would have been hit and I wouldn't have won this trade. So I always like to set it just above the previous high of the where the supply zone started, or the demand zone if you are trading, if you're doing a long trade. And from then on, as soon as we as soon as this little pullback was completed, we then just get a nice smooth trend down and nice big red candles, a little bit of ranging here. But, you know, I don't let my emotions factor out your emotions. If you see it trending sideways, you know, just imagine every trade that you go into as that money's in, do not touch it, that money's gone. For all you know, you've lost the money on that trade, or you've lost, you know, 18% in this case, or however much. Whether that's a good way for you guys to deal with it psychologically as well, cool. You know, go for it. If you guys have your own methods of staying mentally sound and psychologically sound when trading, do that. However, I like to assume that every trade is going to be a loser, and when a winner plays out, awesome. It just lets me get less stressed about losing the money, because if I assumed I've already lost the money, then I don't have to worry about it when eventually the trade does close in a negative. However, thankfully, I don't have to deal with that too often, since I do have a pretty good win rate. So it's all about just finding what works for you to staying mentally strong while you trade. Of course, I still have to remain confident. I still have to identify trends, and I have to look at what the chart is doing. However, when I'm in a trade and the trade is going and I need to take my mind off losing money, that's how I do it. If you guys have any suggestions of how else are good ways to deal with psychology while trading, then leave them in the comments. Anyway, as you can see, we had a 3 risk to reward ratio, specifically a 3.07. So I would have lost 18%, but I did gain 0.54% on a 2-to-1 leverage. So I technically did gain 1.8%, which as we can see here, just gonna measure it out for you guys, for a 2 hour and 45-minute trade is an amazing result. And again, depending on how much leverage you are using, you may have been able to capture a large amount, or if you're trading options, anything like that. So a great trade in my opinion, something that reacted perfectly. This supply zone and the demand zone reacted perfectly. I couldn't have asked for a better trade. And you got to understand, not all trades are going to be like this. Sometimes you're going to have a trade that does not work out. Sometimes the supply zone, sometimes the demand zone will not hold. Whether that be because it's too old, whether that be because it actually wasn't a supply and demand zone, we don't know. And in honesty, it's good to find out why, but in the moment, it doesn't matter. Move on to the next one, and when you're doing your back testing, then see if you can identify why, cool. Put that into your trading plan and make sure you don't repeat the mistake. If you can't identify why, the market's a mystery. We don't know whether it's going to go up or down. Don't stress too much on if a supply and demand zone just doesn't work sometimes, because sometimes it just won't work. But then other times we will have great trades where it works perfectly like this. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments.